All right. God, thank you so much for this time. Thank you for this day. Thank you for Pastor Peter and his heart and willingness to be a part of today's podcast. We ask that you will touch our time together, that it will be a blessing to him, to his church, to other listeners, and ultimately to your glory. In Jesus' name we pray and thank you. Amen. All right. Welcome back to the Church Law Podcast. My name is Erika Cole, known as the Church Attorney. I'm so excited to be with you this season as we are taking this journey through the life cycle of a church. So, in the last episode, I introduced this concept to you of the life cycle of a church. And we talked about how, if you think of it in terms of a circle, we've got the start, and then we got probably some expansion. We might have some peak times, and then we may go around the life cycle where we're maybe having some particular challenges where we decide whether we're continuing or not continuing. And we'll get to that part. But today we're doing something new and different where we're actually having a podcast listener with us today. So I'm excited to have with me on the topic of starting a church guest Peter Olson, who's an executive pastor at Harvest Valley Church. Welcome to the podcast, Peter.
Hey, thanks, Erika. I'm glad to be here.
So glad to have you with me. So I was saying to you a little bit before we press record that as the church attorney, as an attorney, when I get the call from a pastor saying, I've got it in my heart to start a church, but I'm not sure exactly like what to do, right? And so there are the spiritual side, there are the things that you do on the spiritual side, but then there are also the things that I've had the blessing of doing with church planting organizations or other individual churches. And that's like, we've got to file the articles of incorporation. We want to make sure if you find a space that we have a proper lease. We want to make sure that the church gets its EIN and all of these kinds of things that are necessary to operate in I would say just good order and good governance. We want to make sure that you've got your bylaws in order. And many churches decide that they're going to complete their tax exempt status and things like that, right? So that's where my brain goes. But I'd love for you to introduce yourself to our listeners and share a bit about you and what did that process look like when you're starting a new church?
Yeah, no, appreciate the opportunity to share some of the story, I guess. So myself, I actually started out as an engineer, so kind of a non-traditional path to ministry right there, and worked in that field for a while. And then actually my wife and I moved to East Africa, and we lived there as teachers, working there as teachers, and then actually migrated up the coast of the continent there to Ethiopia, where that was our first shot at helping launch a church. So we helped launch an international congregation there in partnership with some people there in Ethiopia, and that was great. Did that for several years, and starting a church in a different country where you speak some of the language and you know most of the laws, hopefully, that was a different experience. And then our family got back to the US partway through 2020, which was an interesting experience. And yeah, so actually, after coming back, I reconnected with a friend of mine who was getting ready to launch a church in Horace, North Dakota, good old middle of the center of the world, or maybe not. But yeah, so I got to be around for some of that pre-launch year. And then that church launched in 2021, and I was able to join the staff team as executive pastor about 5 months later in 2022. And so, yeah, some of the things you mentioned there, articles of incorporation, EIN, some of these terms I didn't actually know until getting into this. Yeah, there's a lot of learning, a lot of prep, and a lot of in our case, trying to just look down the road and do our best to see what was coming and be ready for it, but asking lots of questions, certainly.
Yeah, well, I love that. A big part of this podcast is being a resource to churches, again, along the continuum of that life cycle. I do want to mention, we'll pop in the show notes just some resources that churches can use if you find yourself at the beginning of this cycle. Church Law and Tax has a great publication that's the church governance and pastor, and they cover formation and things like that. And I also have a resource related to tax exempt status. But I want to just mention to you, I didn't say this to you on the front end, but I actually served as a missionary um, back in, well, actually in Latin America. And missions is very much my passion. I started the missions ministry at a church that my husband and I are a part of before we got married. And so I have a heart for missions, and I'm excited to know that you've been able to be of service in that way as well. And as you said, starting a church has its challenges, no matter how you do it, but starting it overseas, I'm sure, is a whole other level. But you said that you helped plan Harvest Valley Church about 3 years ago. How would you describe your journey from day one to now?
Oh man, like pre-day one, like so we started planning. I wasn't directly involved initially, but the plan started about a year and a half before launch day. I think that was a really foundational, formative period of time, because you try and launch something without planning and make it up as you go.
Mm.
Um, I think it just goes better when you do your homework, you ask lots of questions, and you do it not slowly, but you don't rush it. And so we did, you mentioned EIN, AOI kind of stuff. We filed all of those about a year before launching, and just spent some time really investing in the teams and developing leadership, and then started public services in September of 2021 then. And it's really been, so the next 3 years, we're about to turn 3 years old as a church. It's been a fun ride, seeing God be faithful, and a lot of learning and a lot of learning and a lot of learning.
Mhm.
None of us on staff have done this at this scale. And so it's just been fun to learn together and realize we don't need to know all the answers. Um, but we're all committed to pursuing faithfulness and pursuing the vision and mission together, and committed to learning. So
No, I love that. I love what you said about that commitment to learning, and being able to access the resources to move the vision forward. I really also appreciate you mentioned getting a lot of the legal matters in order a year before you fully kicked off. And that can sometimes be tricky in and of itself, right? Because you've got to have enough substance so that when you bring your documents together, when you file them. I know also, every state, of course, the Secretary of State has its rules about what needs to be in your articles. The IRS has its regulations around applying for an EIN or applying for tax exempt status. You have to have some level of having begun. And you describe sort of meeting together. A lot of churches, when they first start, might start with Bible studies, or they may start, in someone's home. How did you all handle that part?
yeah, so initially it was some meetings in coffee shops with people who were interested, and then we call them life groups, small groups of
Hmm.
people who like. That was honestly started because people were saying, "Why can't we start meeting together yet?" And so we started forming, Bible studies, small groups, so people could get together, do fellowship, and then we'd get together once a month, as like a pre-launch meeting. So everyone who was interested in helping start launch the church, we'd come together just for going over vision and going over like what's happening, where are we at on this roadmap.
That's great. And like, what did you experience now that you are a church that's 2 years, almost 3 years old? How would you describe the challenges of starting a new church?
So we're portable. That's one element. So just the flexibility. How do you communicate with people when you're changing venues every other week? Not every other week, but often enough. One thing starting from zero, I think, is really important to keep in mind, is any collection of people that come together where everyone is new. There's no shared history, there's no shared experience. And what humans just tend to do in the absence of history is they fill in their own assumptions, they fill in their own experiences. And so just defining language, defining vision, defining like who are we going to be? Like you have to stay on top of vision leading any organization, but I think especially at the front end, because if you don't get in front of it, people don't leave it as a blank answer. They start filling in their own answers.
Yeah.
And so we just really found that really helpful to have even written out expectations for team members, team leaders, written out mission, vision, values, and just getting really clear on those things at the beginning, because we found in talking with other people who had done this, trying to learn some lessons learned from their pain. Doing that hard work ahead of time is so much easier than trying to put together 100 pieces that 1,000 pieces that 100 people threw in different directions once you started. And so yeah.
I love that. I love that because I often say that silence can be interpreted in multiple ways. And I think that that really highlights the need for good communication all throughout this process. You mentioned even within the team and outside of the team.
Yeah, totally.
Eh,
Because within, like, we found that some people would have very strong opinions on things, and figuring out like where is that actually coming from was very helpful sometimes, because a lot of times like worship style, music style, preaching style, even accounting system, like sometimes people were coming from a situation where they experienced pain. Maybe they were part of a company where something went wrong, or they were part of a church where something offended them. And now they're living in reaction to that. Not that it happened or it was true about our current situation, but they had that past pain. And so just really learning to ask some of those questions and spend enough time investing in those relationships to bring people together on the same page, you know?
Yeah, that's good. And you mentioned that your church is portable. So I want to just highlight that for a moment. Again, my experience has been, and I've worked with churches for over 25 years. Most churches are not on day one buying a property, right? Most churches on day one are in some space. It's often a school or some space that they're able to rent. Sometimes it's a shared space with another church. But a lot of times that gives them the opportunity to be in the midst of the community, to kick the new services off. And I say this kind of in a funny way, but not really funny. I found that inevitably when churches were calling me and they would say, we feel God leading us to start a new church. And I would say, when do you want to kick off? And it was always Easter. The answer was often on Easter Sunday, right? Which makes a lot of sense in a lot of ways. So they've got to be able to have that space. And normally they're not buying right away. What have you found to be the pros and cons, if you will, of operating as a portable church?
Oh man, there's both, honestly.
Hmm.
There's pros and there's cons. So yeah, we started and we were honestly about 6 weeks from our publicly proclaimed launch date and didn't actually have a home yet. We didn't know where we were going to start meeting. But we're thankfully able to get into the middle school. That's where we're able to most typically meet, but then um, also being able to move to some hotel venues when we need to. But being in the school, being in the community, obviously you're talking with those leadership teams, you're with their staff, you're in spaces that people already know. I mean, we have no history of our own. And so that's one of those other things too, like being portable. Sometimes people wonder, are you really going to be around for another year or two? Like there's no building, there's no deep history there, and they don't know where you are necessarily. But being able to be in spaces where people recognize it, that's been beneficial. Um, Part of the cons is it takes a lot of time to set up and tear down, but it's also a pro in the sense that we get to invite people into that team to do that together. And so it's a pro and a con to be
Hmm.
set up and tear down, I guess.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm. And so you describe that as a high degree of flexibility, right? So as a portable church, there's a lot of flexibility. You can identify from time to time what location, or even maybe examine which locations seem to be most effective. Um, but also be flexible to move to other places if there's a time conflict, etc.
Mhm.
I love how you also mentioned the sense of permanence when it comes to a building. We do tend to think, okay, well, now this is a deep commitment, right? And I guess it's even the same in the non-commercial space, in the residential space. When people buy a home, we know that the neighborhood is more stable than renting.
Yeah. Yeah, there's something that I've heard from architects as we're talking to them right now in our current stage, and it's that we first design our tools. It might be a building, it might be a surface structure, but we design our tools, and then forever after, then they design our actions because they influence us. And so, like you're saying, observing our different spaces and observing how they work, how they don't work.
Mhm.
um, yeah, we're really taking notes because we don't want to get down the road to, hopefully building something or buying a property someday and then not knowing how to design it properly.
Right. And of course those church designs have changed over the years too. So I think that's also something that this opportunity allows us to highlight. Well, as much as I'm enjoying this conversation, I know that we're going to have to wrap up shortly, but I did want to just ask you to speak to the listeners. Again, this is something new. We're inviting you on as someone who is a listener to the podcast, and amazingly, because church leaders share this podcast with other leaders, we're listened to all over the nation and all over the world. Your church has grown from 0 to 450 members in less than a year. And I think by all accounts, it would be seen as a success. So, what would you say to churches, to other leaders that are listening who are in that window of being on the newer end, right? Maybe they are brand new, they're in their pre launch stage, or maybe they're just a year or two old. Like, what would you say to them?
Yeah. um, Committing to following after Jesus, because I mean that's got to be where I start, because growth is great. Growth is honestly not the goal. No, because I would say faithful obedience is the goal. Like that's true, I think, for a church. That's true for me as an individual, or any of us. I think that's got to be where what we're seeking and pursuing. And as we do that, just learning, like not trying to do it on our own, but doing it with others, investing in people, bringing people along with us, learning to ask lots of questions and learning what are good questions to ask, and just connecting. One of the best things I've done um, was I was able to get around the table with about a dozen people about 9 months into starting at the church, people, executive pastors at churches who've been doing this a lot more, a lot longer, and just hearing the questions they were wrestling through and learning. What I was really learning was learning what questions to start asking, learning what topics to start paying attention to. So when I started listening to podcasts like this one, and reading blogs, and um, just learning, because I don't know everything. I'm not expected to, but seeking out a network of people to do this together with, and not trying to reinvent everything. We don't need to reinvent it all. That's a great way to burn out and be exhausted. And and yeah, I guess one other thing is realizing something we say a lot is realize a perfect solution doesn't exist. Choose the problem you prefer to solve. There's not going to be something that doesn't involve some problem to be solved. So which problem do we prefer to have? Which one can we better tackle and manage? And in doing that, how do we keep it about people, investing in people, and doing it for the glory of the King? So
That's so, so good. I love that. Which problem would you prefer to solve? And that's a gift, right? Because sometimes we're faced with problems that we don't have an option, right? But it's lovely when you're in a leadership role and you can really be so deliberate as that. I do want to just highlight a few of the other things that you mentioned in this whole question of like, what do you say to other church leaders who are in the same place as Harvest Valley? You talked about committing to follow after Jesus, making that the first thing, because honestly, people say to me often that church is a business, and I don't agree. There's absolutely, obviously, a business side of church, and that's a large part of the what I feel, right? And other leaders who may be professionals, accountants, insurance providers, bookkeepers, CPAs, right? But church is the bride of Christ, and we want to make that the central focus of everything we do. I'm not a pastor, but man, that really gets me choked up when I think about that because it is our opportunity to show the love of Christ on earth. And so I love that we make that the focal point, of course. But you also talked about the importance of being clear on mission because every church doesn't have the same mission, but being clear about the mission and vision for your church, because that is what will set you forth on the path, obviously, of meeting point number one, right? Following after Jesus for your particular call. So, you also talked about the importance of being prayerful, about asking for God for the right leadership. And I love the humility that I hear about asking for questions, which means that you are by definition being a good listener. So I appreciate what you've shared. Any final words before we close out?
No, I appreciate the time. And yeah, thank you to your listeners too for what they invest into in pursuing what God's called them to. It's what you said. Every church does not have the same goal. Every church does
Mhm.
not have the same calling. One of the things that we've experienced is within about a mile of where we typically meet, they've put up 1,000 houses in the last 3 years. That's one
Wow.
reason right there why you're able to see more people being a part of our church family right now. But not every church is in that situation. Not every church is called to the same thing. And so, what's God calling us to, though? And are we content with that and faithful to pursue that in obedience?
I love it. I love that faithfulness. And I just want to mention to listeners as we close out here, I want to invite you to something that I'm pretty excited about. I call it Information with Inspiration. And this is our 17th annual Church Compliance Conference. It is the place where we provide top experts. It's completely online this year. It's going to be on Thursday, September 19th. Mark your calendars. Plus, as podcast listeners, you'll get 20% off using the discount link in the show notes. And we appreciate you so much, Peter, for being with us. Thank you so much to our listeners who make this podcast possible. And we look forward to continuing the journey through the rest of the series. Come back next time. Thanks.